Content. All right. Okay, here we go. So just to recap, today we're talking about financial sustainability. And as you, I'm sure, know from other projects, this is the most exciting part. It's like it's one thing to have an idea, it's another thing to figure out the resource engine to help make it work, right? It's kind of like when they teach you math, and then they're like, oh wait, there's calculus, and you're like, oh shoot. So this is the fun part. But I'm glad you're here, and like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to speak up as we go, or at the end as well. Just a recap of where we come from. If you missed any of these, we do have recordings. If there's a session you would like to revisit, just let us know. Today's the financial sustainability workshop. Next week, we're doing a Q&A session just generally. So if you have any questions about any part of your application, that's the chance to go into it. And then the following week is the presentations and judging. So just like finals, everything's coming to a close soon, right? The semester goes fast. One clarification we did want to share, just based on other questions we got from other participants, just in the sections of your project proposal, there's a section that says project overview, like the very beginning. And just to clarify that the judges will be looking for, the judges will be looking for peace building theories, peace building ideas in your project, right? So somebody asked us to clarify that, like, I have a project, is it peace building? And it's kind of like, well, it's up to you to make that connection. It's up to you to show how your project incorporates the theories you've learned in a class, or the approaches you've learned. Something that somebody reading it would say, oh, I recognize this, right? This is my language, somebody who's a peace builder. So just to clarify that, so everybody's on the same page. That was one of the questions we got. Just wanted to add that clarity. Today, funding. And there's two applications for funding, and we'll go over it in a little more detail. One is within the project description itself, and then one is in the one-year plan you're preparing. Like, if funded, what will the first year look like? And there's a funding element to that as well. So great quote, just to give us something to think about. What is financial sustainability? Often we just think of it as money. There's more types of resources than money. And I think this quote is helpful there. The ability to generate resources to meet the needs in the present without compromising the future. You might say, how in the world could an organization do this? Well, if you've ever worked in an organization, this is an example that does fundraising. They often talk of fundraising cycles. And one reason to do that is you can exhaust donors, right? If you approach them too often, for example, they might give the first time, might give less the second time, and might not pick up their phone the third time, right? So that's just one example of it is possible to compromise your future by overemphasizing the present. If your financial need is big in the present, that's okay, but your strategy to meet it can't compromise your future. It's kind of what she's reminding us of. There's other ways that can happen too, but that's a fairly common one that comes to mind, especially in startup stage, for a project or an organization. Why is this important? A little self-evident, but really the ability to have impact, which is really what we're after, depends on your resource engine, which finances is a big component. Right? So I've worked for NGOs that have lost their funding, and it's a crisis. When you go from stable funding to no funding, that has a big impact. I've worked for NGOs that have been blessed with new funding. That's a fun side of the experience to be on as well. It's like, hey, we're growing. Let's grow and add some staff and add some projects and that kind of thing. So the sustainability of funding, just like in a business, you do your best to plan. It's not 100% under your control, obviously, but you do your best to diversify, you do your best to plan. And just as with any plan, it won't always work out the way that you planned it to, but that's part of your adaptability and part of your skill set as the person in charge is how do you navigate those waters. There's four main categories you can think about with your project or with any project. And I think this is important because often we just think of grants, right? Like, I'm going to write 10 grants and I'll get 2 of them funded just statistically. and that'll set my organization up. But a really important principle for grant writing, for all funding, but especially for grant writing, is this quote: financial capital flows from social capital. So what that means is, even with grants, when you're writing a grant that's a public grant, your odds of success increase if you have a connection with the granting agency, right? So if you have an agency that you want to approach at some point for a grant, it's a great idea to approach them for an informational interview first, months before you might need the grant. Be like, hey, I'm part of this project, I'm part of this NGO, like whatever your introduction is. I know you're a granting agency, I'd love to find out more about how your program works. Like, what are your projects you funded in the past year? What were successful? What were the ones that struggled? What advice do you have for me? And if you think that's an awkward conversation, it might be, but put yourself on their side. If you ever meet somebody that works in a funding organization, their job is to place their money in good places. So if you think of it that way, it kind of lowers the anxiety level in approaching them, because you're actually potentially helping them do their job. I remember the first time I met somebody who worked for a government organization, and their job was to deliver grants. And it's like, sometimes we'll have somebody say, here's a pot of money, I need you to place it in 2 weeks, right? And it's like, and it just depends on who I know. Like, what organizations do I know that do good work that I can phone up and say, hey, would you like a grant for $50,000 to do a project? And that would have a project that'd be ready to go. Or you'd have other stories where, like, we have a grant application coming up in 3 months. I need to find 10 applicant organizations, and I want 10 quality grants. You could actually give people feedback on their draft grants. He was a little exceptional in that sense. Often that isn't a common thing, right? But just to show that as much anxiety as we have in applying for grants, there's people whose job it is to award grants that also have a little bit of anxiety, and it's in their best interest to connect with good people doing good work. So that informational interview, that reach out of, let's build some social capital here. I might not be the person you're looking to award a grant to, but maybe I know somebody. You can help them out as well, right? So give yourself a little more credit, I think, than sometimes we give ourselves, and we're just like, I'm just here asking for money. Like they actually could use some of our help sometimes as well. But grant writing is definitely important. If you've never written a grant before, it's not too different from an essay. It's just very structured, and this is where the winning project, if they choose to be incubated by Pono Peace Initiative, this is something we could help with, is grant writing and helping build some of these connections and giving feedback on grant proposals. Your first one or two, it's just like an essay. It takes a lot of time, and then you start to get the hang of it. Like, okay, I understand how this works. Fundraising, selling products, in-kind donations. Let me show you some examples, just to share a little more about what can fit in these categories. So here is a local granting organization, Hawaii Community Foundation. It's good to spend some time on their website. They have all kinds of grants, large and small. And they're often contacted by organizations to administer grants for them as well. So for example, the name escapes me right now, but there was an organization we were really interested in that had a mandate in the Asia Pacific region for a specific type of project. They had their own fund, but Hawaii Community Foundation administered it for them. So this is the kind of place, if you reach out to them and say, hey, this is what I want to do, I'm looking for grants to support it. If they don't have it, they probably know somebody that would. They're so well connected in this space because this is their business. So a great place to make a connection. They have a grant database, they have a grant calendar, all these kinds of things that can help you connect to grants that fit. Because in the end, grants are about alignment, they're about fit. If you find grants that fit who you are and what you want to do, your odds of success increase. So this is a great place to start. And if your project is in a different geography, there's probably a similar organization there. It seems like every state or city has something of this nature. Fundraising. You've probably seen fundraising. Cancer is a common one. We're raising funds for a cancer initiative, that kind of thing. This is an example back in Canada where they actually have individuals and teams that raise money. They do a bike race. Maybe you've done this before. Like, we used to do this for soccer. We're doing a kickathon. Can you donate so many cents per yard that I kick the soccer ball? Even that's an example of fundraising. Fundraising can work quite well, but it's pretty much reliant on both social capital and people's willingness to go knock doors. And I say that kind of in quotes, but it's, if you set up a fundraising campaign, it's how many people do you know that you can approach to contribute, and are they willing to, or are they exhausted or have their other priorities? Because if people say no, it's not always that they don't like your project. Sometimes they just don't have extra funding to contribute to something at that point in time, right? That's another important thing, is never take a no personally. Just take it as and if they say no, you could respond with something like, well, if we do this in the future, would you be okay with us approaching you again? And often you'll get it, yeah, sure. You can put me on your list. But fundraising depends on who you know, and it also depends on who you're willing to connect with. That's kind of the door knocking piece. Like, again, as a kid playing soccer, we go knock on the neighborhood. Right? And even then, even though we didn't know them, they kind of knew we had something in common. We lived in the same place. So it's a lot harder to reach out to strangers. So this is a strategy that works if you have a good social network. Right? The other thing about fundraising is if you do a graph of results over time, like say you had a fundraising campaign once a year or twice a year, your results would increase every time you do it. The first time you do it is the hardest because you're building relationships. This is the first time you've gone out and asked and created some kind of experience that you're offering as a fundraising effort, right? So again, back to that principle that financial capital flows from social capital. Like, you're just starting, right? The second time, people will be like, oh yeah, I remember you. You did that really cool pie in the face fundraising thing, right? Or whatever it is. They'll smile and be like, yeah, I remember that. That was fun. Yeah, I'd love to participate again. Third time, before you know it, like fifth or sixth time, you're part of their culture, the organization. Like, hey, this is what we do every year. We participate in this thing, right? You can get there, but it takes time. So your first time is the hardest time and the least rewarding in terms of financial results. But as a long-term strategy, this can definitely be something that you can look at. Selling a product, many organizations do this, and some of them kind of pivot this way when they feel fatigue around fundraising, and they're like, what else can we do besides just asking people for money? Maybe we can be a little bit of a social enterprise where we can sell a product and the profits go towards our project, right? And that's perfectly reasonable as well. It requires a bit of business know-how because it's easy to set up an e-commerce store and lose money. And if you talk to entrepreneurs, a lot of them have done that. So none of these are 100% like it will work, right? They all have their risks. But if you have business experience or somebody that has business experience, you're selling a product, can definitely be a revenue stream for your project. You have to be careful though, right? Like I said, you understand your costs, understand how your marketing is going to work, understand your price point. Often people charge a little extra when they're selling to benefit a charity or an NGO product. People understand, they're not buying based on price. They're buying because there is a cause they're supporting. That's why we spend $40 for a t-shirt that we could get somewhere else for 15, right? Because, the t-shirt isn't 2.5 times nicer. It's just we're willing to support the cause, by spending the extra for it. So this is definitely something that can be done. And again, if you have experience, if you know Shopify, if you got sources, this can be more or less doable depending on how much previous experience you have doing it. Another category, in-kind donations. These also count on a project, and they can take different forms. In-kind donations is basically a donation that isn't financial. Right? So some people donate cars, and then the charity takes the cars and they either sell them or scrap them, and they earn money that way. You might have a project that requires a grant writer. You might know a grant writer and say, hey, would you be willing to donate time to our project to write a grant for us? And they say, sure, that's a donation of time to your project. Or you might know a marketer, right? Or someone's like, hey, I can do you a logo and a website and a brochure for your project. You can include that then. That's an in-kind donation, right? That's a donation of talent and time. So any donation of that sort that you think could benefit your project can fit as part of your financial planning for your project, right? So again, this is where resources are money, but they're also energy, right? If you look at it that way. So For the competition, as I mentioned at the start, there's really two requirements, right, where you'll be thinking about finances. There's a specific section where you'll be evaluated on your financial plan, your funding model and how it'll work basically. So your funding model may be one of those four categories, it may be all four of those four categories, it may be a combination of them. There's no right or wrong. It just needs to make sense for what you're doing and the skill set and experience you have, right? In other words, you shouldn't be doing an online store if you've never done one before and don't know anybody that has, right? This would be the wrong time to try it out. You want some kind of experience that says, even though none of these are 100%, I'm confident that this one has a good likelihood of working, right? So that's the financial plan piece. And then in the 1 year plan, similar, what would the cost be for running your project for the first year? And how would you budget for that? What would the incomes be to meet the expenses, that kind of thing. You want your 1 year plan to say, kind of as the conclusion, here's the costs to run this for a year, and here's where that money will come from. Right? You want that to balance out. Because when somebody judges that and says, here's the plan for the first year, it's going to cost, I'm just going to pick round numbers. It's going to cost $10,000 to do these 6 things. They're going to bring in $10,000 by doing these 3 things. The 3 things look reasonable. Okay, that's a reasonable plan. And again, we all know plans never work out the way they're planned, but it shows you've done your homework to understand what gives you the best likelihood of success and how you can also adapt to things that, as they happen, not quite as you planned, right? That adaptability is important. So again, these are the 2 parts where you'll be working on your finances. Neither of these are exhaustive. You can see the word count, they're small. If it helps to use Excel, go ahead. If it helps to do it in Word, just type it out as a table, go ahead. Like there isn't a formatting requirement for how this works. It's whatever works best for you, but that's kind of what will be looked for. So that is the overview on finances. Let me open it up for any questions at this point. Any questions, anything you'd like clarity on as far as the financial plan part of your project proposal?
Can I just ask? I know you help with Ponopono. This is your NGO, right? Can I ask like how much you put into your initial like investment of the NGO?
Oh, our initial investment was really just what was needed to get it legally set up and started. And there's been an ongoing investment. We kind of have a monthly, quarterly budget that, it's our responsibility to make sure we have the income to meet that. But for us, it was the initial setup of registering with the IRS, as a 501c3. And for us, we looked at, do we do that ourselves or do we hire a lawyer? We kind of went through that process. But your startup costs don't have to be high, right? And again, we weren't starting as an incubated project with another organization, which you have the option to, right? Which would perhaps remove some of these requirements. But for us, we needed to start as our own organization and get set up legally, from day one, and then be able to kind of build from there. Does that help, Heather? That's what you're asking. Yeah. So in other words, we didn't start with, we have a $10,000 grant or a $50,000 project. We started with, how do we exist legally? And then every 2 to 3 months, we have our board meetings and we do our financial reporting and planning and updating and all those kinds of things. So, any other questions about this as you're thinking of your projects and putting together your financial plan?
Sorry, I have another question. How specific are we expected to, or how, I guess, so if we are planning on collaborating with another organization, do we want to have like specific numbers from that organization of what they're willing to like contribute, or Or if it's like in-kind donations, do we need to have those specifically listed, or can it be more tentative as the collaborators
That's a good question.
figuring it out?
Yeah, and that's kind of the nature of this work is often it's like there's a difference between planning and execution, right? So even if an organization came to you and said, hey, would you collaborate with us on a project? You know, I'm just gonna make something up as an example, Heather, but you're an amazing singer. We want you to come sing at our dinner that we're putting on to raise funds by charging people to come to the dinner, right? And you'd be like, well, my singing, usually I charge $1,000 a performance, but I'd be happy to donate to you for your charity. So they could write that in 100%. But when the time comes, you might be out of the country singing in Europe, right? And it might not work out the way it was planned. But either like in that scenario, even though it's tentative, you want as much as you know how to put in there, right? If that makes sense. Like but in all of these, you do the best you can with what you know as you're putting it together. And from a judging perspective, what they're looking for really is, does it make sense? You know, like if you were hiring a marketing agency and the judge is like, yeah, I've done that too, and I know they charge $500 and they're saying they're going to charge you $10,000, that's not right, right? Something's wrong, right? So it just needs to make sense and be reasonable. All budgets are tentative. I think that's a good principle to make clear. We're doing our best with our budgets, but they're not written in stone for a reason, right? So what happens, just so I have one more thing to add to that, when you prepare a budget for an organization, like say you're preparing your 1 year budget, like say you were working for us as an employee, right? And you came to us with a budget for your project. We would expect the budget to change as the project went on, but we would also expect there to be discussions around the changes. And so every time, not necessarily every time an expense was different, but as our board met or as me met with you and they're like, here's an update on the project. And this is how we had planned. This is actually what it turns out. And this is what we're going to do. We're like, perfect. That makes good sense, right? So there's kind of a transparency that comes with budgeting, and the transparency creates trust, right? Like even if you got a grant from the Hawaii Community Foundation, say they gave you $5,000 to do a project and your project depended on a partner, and then say the partner, something happened, a death in the family, nothing foreseeable, nothing their fault, really, we can't do it, right? Like, well, that affects our project. You know, the right thing to do would be go back to the Hawaii Community Foundation and say, this is what we applied for, this is what you awarded, this is what happened, this is what we'd like to do because of what happened. Are you okay with that? And usually they say yes, but they appreciate the transparency, right? They appreciate being brought along through that process. Nobody likes to be surprised, I guess, is what you want to avoid, right? We're like, we gave you 5,000 for this and you did that and we're confused. Like they won't ask for the money back, but they'll probably never give you another one, right? Is usually what happens in that kind of situation. So, yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question, but I hope this is not a stupid question, but I'm curious, and I just got here because I had a recent appointment earlier. Um, with the financial plan that we will all gonna submit later on, what do you think would be an ideal financial plan for the projects that we have? Like generally speaking, what would be an ideal financial plan for you?
Yeah, you want it to be clear and easy to follow. It doesn't need to be complicated, and you can do it in Excel or in Word. But really, if you just even if you just have, here's our costs or expenses, and here's our income sources, right? And they can be financial or they can be in kind, and you want them to balance. You know, if your project's going to cost 10,000, where's the 10,000 going to come from to pay for it? You know, because you can imagine if you were, let's say you're the executive director of an organization, you know, like once you're done school, and somebody brought you a project, it's going to cost 50,000, and here's how we're going to get 10,000. We have no idea how to get 40. Your stress level is going to shoot up, right? You're going to have an immediate biological response to that of, this is a stressful project. So you want to avoid that in all your project proposals here and anytime throughout your career, just by having the balance, right? If you have a good sense of what your costs are, they're reasonable and realistic, and you're doing your best to say, this is where we think our money will come from, and they balance, you know, that's what they're going to look for. make sure they balance and make sure they're reasonable. Does that help?
Yes, that helps. Yeah, thank you.
And if you look at the requirements, I think it's 250 words for one, 200 for the other. So these don't have to be lengthy descriptions or lengthy sections, but there's enough space there to be clear. So. All right, any other questions? We will have the recording we'll put up. So if you'd like a copy of this recording or any of the recordings from the other sessions, just let us know. We'd be happy to share a link to it. And as I mentioned at the beginning, next week, we will have a Zoom. It's optional. All it is Q&A. So it's a week before your submissions are due. But at that point, bring any questions you have on any section of your project, and it's a chance to ask them. So that'll be next week. So we'll start at the same time and we'll last as long as there's questions for. So, all right. Well, if there's no other questions tonight, let's say thank you to each of you, and we're wish you well on putting this together. We're excited to see your ideas and submissions. And again, any questions at any time, reach out, but we'll look forward to your questions next week specifically. So we'll talk to you then.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks. Bye.